This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The Middle Ground Mike is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now, support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us. Every camera is pointed at Washington and Tehran. This is exactly where they want you to look. But I've got a good friend here, Rambi, and the real story isn't even in the same time zone as either one of us. It's halfway around the world, and Ron's going to help us break it down. Ron, again, welcome to the show. I really appreciate you being on because you're the man with the inside knowledge that a lot of people wish they had.
Well, thank you, Joe, and you're the man with the right attitude towards politics. So it's a match made in heaven.
Yeah, no, we were talking before the show, and obviously, the Iran things kind of went a little bit further than I thought it would. I thought this was going to be over a whole lot faster. You warned that it wouldn't be.
Yeah.
I was kind of hoping it would be, what the president was saying in and out, but the part that nobody's really saying is, we were talking is the plutonium. Everybody's focusing on uranium, but like you were saying, the plutonium changes the timeline completely. So let me ask you, how close is Iran to having a plutonium pathway and the backstory behind it?
Well, that's a big question. Right now, probably not too close because the one reactor that they were building to process plutonium in Iraq, a couple hundred miles from Tehran, was hit by the Israelis and by us during our attacks on Iran. And it had no uranium in it because you need uranium in order to make plutonium. So there wasn't any radioactivity as a result of it, but that reactor was a reactor that could produce up to one or two nuclear weapons if it were to go online. The other reactors that are more important in terms of plutonium are ones that have been built by the Russians over not too far from the island of Karg, right? On land in a place called Bushehr. And Bushehr, there were nuclear reactors there that were built by the Shah of Iran back in the early 1970s, and were attacked during the Iran-Iraq War by Iraq. That was in 1983-84, and the Revolutionary Guard was in charge of the country by this time, and the Ayatollahs, and they couldn't figure out why they were attacking the reactor because it was for civilian nuclear use. And then they finally dawned on them that the Iraqis thought they were making plutonium there for nuclear weapons. And then Iran realized that, okay, that must mean that Iraq is making nuclear weapons from plutonium. So perhaps we should have a nuclear program, not just for the great Satan, the United States, and the little Satan, Israel, but if Iraq is going to attack us with nuclear weapons, we have to have them too, whether it be for deterrence purposes or using against Iraq. So the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 88 really did create an atmosphere where the Iranians had to start thinking about whether or not they'd have to defend themselves from an Iraq that would attack them with a nuclear weapon. Over 1 million people died in that war, by the way. There were
The Iran-Iraq War?
Yeah,
Wow.
over 8 years. And that also created a certain Sunni-Shia divide that has existed to this day. And in any case, what happened then, just like what happened in Iraq, he did everything underground until it was discovered during Operation Desert Storm, and Operation Iraqi Freedom was another. We went back in and found out to what degree he had nuclear weapons. But for the Iranians, it didn't start with worries about the United States and Israel. It started with worries about Iraq. But plutonium, there's enough plutonium that is made in the Bushehr reactors that since the mid-2000s, the Russians have had a nuclear agreement with the Islamic Revolutionary government to build Bushehr nuclear reactors that produce enough fuel rods, or what we say spent fuel, that could be reprocessed into up to 200 nuclear weapons. And this has been pointed out by a colleague of mine, but a gentleman by the name of Henry Sokolsky, who worked in the Bush administration as a non-proliferation expert, let alone for the vice president at one point. And he runs a place called the Non-Proliferation Education Center. And he just published in the Wall Street Journal, I think this last week, an article saying, let's not forget about Bushehr, and that the IAEA needs to go in there to make sure that the uranium that is in the spent fuel rods does not get reprocessed and diverted for nuclear weapons use. I also note this last week that the 700 Russians that usually work there have left and evacuated, and only 20 are remaining.
Wow.
And that's on the surface because President Trump has said that he's going to attack power plants as well as bridges once the ceasefire ends if there's no deal. I don't think we're going to attack a nuclear power plant that has radiation in it because of the implications of radioactivity and what it would do to the civilian populations. But at the same time, the Russians, not knowing for sure, sent 95% of their technicians home, which also means that the Iranians are going to have to pick up the slack. And what are they going to do if the Russians aren't there? So it's important that we realize that uranium enrichment is the path that they took, primary path at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, and those have been the focus of where is the enriched uranium that could be used for bombs. But let's not forget the spent fuel at Bushehr, and there's several reactors there that have been built by Russians since the mid 2000s that could be diverted and should be covered by the International Atomic Energy Agency, should be monitored by whatever intelligence we have, let alone satellite monitoring, to make sure that that is also taken care of. You don't hear about that too much, but I think Henry Sokolsky has done a good job of putting that on the map. So I encourage everyone to read that article in the Wall Street Journal.
Wow. I did not know that.
Well, now you do. Now you do.
So,
And Henry's been involved in this for years, and so he's a very thoughtful strategist in terms of how to prevent nuclear weapons from spreading. So it's worth reading.
yeah, I mean, but who's watching this the closest right now? Is it primarily US intelligence or other countries like more locked in on this than we are?
Well, Israel's always watching everything when it comes to nuclear weapons, and I'm sure that they're very aware of what's going on here. Our intelligence would be very aware, hopefully, but the focus has been on the enriched uranium, recovering that. But we can't let the plutonium issue leak out the back door, if you will.
Right. That's pretty simple if you want to think about it like that. Like we shouldn't want them to getting it out the back door.
Right.
And thinking of the back door, the back channel that, we're not talk that I don't think people talk about it. If this is the first time you've heard of plutonium mentioned in this conversation, drop a comment below for me and Ron, and if we see it, we'll comment in it. So, we can respond to it and any information because it was news to me, guys. I'll
Well,
tell you that.
let's remember that plutonium was one of the two ways that we used nuclear weapons in World War II. That it was discovered in 1941 by Glenn Seaborg, a 28-year-old physicist at UC Berkeley, that used the cyclotron and discovered this. I mean, uranium was discovered, believe it or not, in 1789 by a German physicist, and he named it after Uranus. Why? Because that was the last planet that had been discovered. Then in 1940, the next element on the periodic table was called Neptunium, after Neptune, and that was discovered at UC Berkeley too in 1940 at the same cyclotron. What did Seaborg name his element, plutonium, after the last planet in our solar system? But he didn't know apparently that Pluto was named after the Roman god of death and the Greek lord of the underworld. So what an appropriate association for plutonium that was used in the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The plutonium pathway was also the primary pathway that North Korea used in order to get there. The reason for it, you need less plutonium than you do uranium for a bomb. We'll go into the details, but you get the general idea. And its critical mass is about, say, a third of that of U2. So you need a third as much to create a weapon. And many of our weapons during the Cold War and today were made of plutonium for that reason.
I'm not going to lie to you. I would have never known that. I
Hey,
would have
well,
never known that. Wow,
Yeah,
that is
so
great. No,
so
I
there you
mean,
have it.
when you're kinda, like, thinking about that, another nuclear power is Pakistan, right?
Yep.
I wanna talk about how that, because they almost never make the news cycle even though they are really playing a key role. Because when I look at what's actually moving between the US and Iran right now, Islamabad keeps showing up. Like, what about them is kinda like that middle area?
Let's take a quick break.
You can judge a company's entire philosophy by its cheapest product. That's why I looked at Brio's nose and ear trimmer before I even considered any other product. And what I found told me everything I needed to know. Most nose trimmers are a joke, a weak motor that pulls, that ouch. Brio's is a statement, a powerful motor, a clean cutting blade. It is definitive proof that their obsession with engineering is real. And that proof is the most valuable feature they offer. It removes risk. It gives you the confidence to invest in the flagship Beardscape products, knowing the philosophy isn't just a marketing copy. It's built into every tool they make. Start with the proof, upgrade your system today. The code is middle ground at brioforlife.com.
Well, Pakistan's a nuclear weapon state in and of itself. It exploded a nuclear weapon 1998, as did India. And that was a very tense time that I was involved in. And we were trying to get nuclear controls put on those weapons so that a terrorist couldn't, come in and steal it, fire it off, and create a nuclear war. And eventually that happened. But Pakistan is technically an ally of the United States, even though we have our differences on terrorism. And we, in fact, found Osama bin Laden hidden in Pakistan. So there are issues we have with the control of terrorism in Pakistan, but Pakistan is technically an ally. They got help from the Chinese with their nuclear weapons development and also from a program called Atoms for Peace that was created in 1957 during the Eisenhower administration, where the idea was that we could use atoms for nuclear energy for the benefit of humankind instead of for weapons to the detriment of humankind. And also you could use the radioactivity from radium and whatnot for medicine and for killing bacteria and crops and things of that nature. So the Atoms for Peace program was started. And what the idea there was, you could gain that technology if you promised to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which came about in 1968 under Lyndon Johnson, and that you would forswear that you would only use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes and not for nuclear weapons. And in exchange for that promise, you would receive nuclear technology. And there was an organization called the International Atomic Energy Agency, which I worked for as a graduate student in Vienna, Austria, based. That they would send inspectors around to make sure that everything was up to snuff and that the nuclear materials being used for civilian use were not diverted, and that's the word it's always used, that were not diverted for military use. And but some of the countries that received atoms for peace help, including those in South Asia, at least it's alleged that that technology could also be used for the production of fissile materials. Fissile means that it can be explode as an atomic weapon, and that Atoms for Peace has a spotty record in terms of staying peaceful. And one of the places that's under review, if not under criticism, is South Asia, where both Pakistan and India have acquired nuclear weapons and don't get along very well with one another, if you've noticed.
Oh yeah, Kashmir. I mean, that's a big hotbed area
Yeah,
right there.
that's a whole nother discussion.
You do upset on that.
You could do trust me, all the crises that have happened over Kashmir. And at one point, I remember right after 1998, the nuclear tests by Pakistan and India. I was in a discussion with Indian nuclear strategists and American non-proliferation experts where they had very unkind things to say about their neighbors in Pakistan, and that they didn't need any controls on their weapons because they had enough population to survive anything that Pakistan blew up.
Yes.
And uh, that was kind of shocking to all the Americans in the room, but we kept at it, and the American government kept at it, and controls were eventually put on Indian nuclear weapons. But let's just say they don't get along very well, and that's not what you want. Hot-headedness when it comes to nuclear deterrence.
Oh yeah, no, you definitely don't want that. I mean,
E-
hotheads do not pay the bills in that situation.
Well, and you want calmer thoughts to prevail, and that is what
Yes.
happens if you go down this path. And if you are responsible for the protection of your people, one of the ways to do that is not to have them go up in a mushroom cloud.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt at all. When you think about that, I guess you could kind of go, I mean, I'm sure everybody by now knows what we've been saying. If you didn't know Pakistan was in the middle of this, you should, but maybe you don't. Drop a comment and we can talk about it.
Another
But you
interesting about they have a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been attacked. What have
Wow.
Pakistanis had to supply? They have supplied airplanes as well as troops to Saudi Arabia. That's been quiet, maybe unnoticed, but they have skin in the game not only there, but where do they get their oil from? The Persian Gulf. So
Mm,
they're also experiencing the costs and the economic costs of oil going up to whatever it went up to 118. It's better now, under $100, but it's still up there. And so their economy is suffering. They have a mutual defense pact, and they have to provide things to the Saudis because they've been attacked, and they want to improve relations with the United States, and so they've got skin in the game here too. And Trump knows that Pakistan is at least an ally of the United States. We provide them with lots of military equipment, and I think that's why he's listening to the Pakistanis when they're asking for an extension of the ceasefire simply as a nod, because he's also imposed a blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, which is putting another pressure point on the Iranian economy. He's taking care of the military threat by taking out the Navy, taking out the Air Force, taking out the air defense systems, working on getting rid of the IRGC and the Basij and the clerics and the Ayatollah. But now economically, what sustains the regime? It's the sale of oil. And the sale of oil all goes through either Karg or the Strait of Hormuz. And so if you stop that economic lifeline to the current regime, they have nothing to pay their people, nothing to pay their military, nothing to pay themselves. And the economy, which was already in bad shape, is only going to get worse. And so you've created the military leverage by wiping out a lot of their military assets, and now you're trying to create the economic leverage to get them to collapse. And it's going to be a difficult time for uh, not just those in the West who have to pay more in gas prices, but those in Iran who have no food, have no water, have no industry. And if you take out the bridges and the power plants, will not have any way to go anywhere, or any way to keep the lights on. And so the lights may go out for the regime, but it's also going to affect the Iranian people to an extent that I don't know if we fully appreciate.
no, well, when you think about that, we were talking about Pakistan, right?
Yeah.
In the end, what are they? And I guess this is kind of like a two part. What are they getting out of this? Because a big thing is their leverage. They depend a lot on the IM. Well, they're facing pressure because of China's involvement with their debt. They're heavy a debt load.
Hmm.
And the IMF is putting a lot of pressure, on Islamabad right now.
Hmm.
So is that playing a factor into this?
Well, that's one of the factors. Yes, economically, they're under the gun. They share a border with Iran, and so they're concerned about refugees. They also have the second largest Shia population in the world after Iran, which has the first. And so they're worried about political instability if Iranian Shia, especially if the IRGC makes its way to Pakistan.
Right.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And on the other side, Iraq could also be disturbed in that way because it shares a 1,000-mile border. And remember, it had a war with Iran for 8 years across that border, and it's 50% Shia. So it would be easy for Shia population to assimilate in Iran or cause problems, depending on your point of view. Pakistan has skin in this game on a number of levels.
Right. Well, when you kind of like, we'll forward a little bit back to trying to think the data point that really stopped me when you were talking about the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah,
Obviously, 20% of the world's oil goes through there.
correct.
And all kind of like our president, all they have to do is, put out some kind of crazy statement and they know it's going to, skyrocket prices. What would Iran actually need to see concretely, I should say, to not threaten the strait? Is there a number? Is there a policy? Is there a facing gesture that they want?
Well, I think what this is that's all they have left in terms of leverage is the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, what else do they have leverage? They don't have the military leverage. And the economic leverage is something that they're playing for time. And this is why they, you know, would like to see a ceasefire for the next 30 years because they know that they're playing for time, and they're playing for time so that the American public and the Western world will get tired of this and go home at some point. And the pain from at the pump, which drives politics more here than it does there, will play out in the midterms and let alone the next presidential election, if they can keep control over the Strait of Hormuz. And what has happened since President Trump imposed the blockade? Well, the Iranians have lost about 400 to 500 million dollars a day because that's their main moneymaker, overseas sales of oil that have been prevented from going through the strait. So what did they do over the last 24 hours? The Iranians seized two container ships and attacked a third by suggesting that dual blockade, which is an act of war under international law. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, they chose the word quarantine instead of blockade so as not to provoke a nuclear war because that was what was at stake during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But this was a blockade which has been imposed in World War I against the Germans and World War II against the Japanese. World War One was against, trying chemicals that were being used for explosives, phosphates and what have you. But the phosphates are also part of fertilizers, and so there was a effect on agriculture in Germany that was unexpected, and so a lot of Germans went hungry as a result of the blockade. And the same thing happened in Japan during World War II. People lost weight because of the blockade. And folks in Iran are going to be losing weight because of this blockade because oil prices go up. That means they also have to pay more for food. They have to pay more for food that they can't grow in Iran because of a 5-year drought. So it all plays into politics of the strait, and so happens that this is Iran's last leverage under circumstances. They would like to see a ceasefire go indefinitely because that means they don't have to change the regime, even if it's at its third echelon of leadership since the month of 13,000 sorties. 13,000 sorties in a month. That's unprecedented. We've had 16 casualties, and those are tragic. But under the circumstances of all the military has had to do in a month, it's pretty minimal compared to what it could have been.
Right. No, I totally understand that. When you look at the US economy, right, and
Right.
how they stack up, we have the economic might to really kind of chokehold them when it breaks it down. And
Hmm.
and that's what really gives us the advantage. But does Iran, outside of oil prices, does Iran have any economic advantages of this?
Oil's its major leverage point because it's the third largest reserves in the world. And because it has so many reserves, one should question why they need nuclear power. In fact, they have enough they have enough oil and gas to last for economics, their economy for 900 years. So they don't need the nuclear power for their domestic economy. They want it for strategic purposes, and that's been clear because they haven't been willing to give it up. And what did they say during the negotiations? When we offered them 3% enriched uranium for nuclear energy use in perpetuity, they said, "Thank you very much. We're not interested." So they're not really
Right.
interested in nuclear power. They're interested in Iranian nuclear control and strategic value of, shall we say, enriched uranium or plutonium, so that they could do two things: cover for what they're doing in the Middle East in terms of supporting proxies, and the support of terrorism. And the second would be achieving some sort of nuclear status as a rogue state in the Middle East that has to be dealt with. That would be terrible for not just the United States and Israel, but it would also generate an arms race. Saudi Arabia has said that as soon as Iran builds a nuclear weapon, it will build one. Turkey has said that it would follow suit, and who knows who else. But this would be terrible for nonproliferation, and that's why this is more important than people tend to realize.
No, it is very, very important. And people generally don't realize things like that until it's too late.
Yeah. And so you can believe that it's a farce, that this is all created in fantasy land, and it's fairy dust being thrown by President Trump across the Middle East. But that fairy dust has been awfully real to both Democratic and Republican administrations since the discovery of secret nuclear sites back in the 1980s.
Right. No, 1000%. Well, when you kind of like we'll pivot to the ceasefire like we were talking about a little
Sure.
bit,
Yeah.
and kind of a feedback into this. Is China brokered, I believe it was it 2023, the Saudi Iran deal, if you want to call it that. And
Right.
Xi Jinping is obviously pushing for a ceasefire because of the oil.
Right.
Is it just because of the oil, or is
Yeah.
this or is he trying to do what we're trying to do, geopolitical positioning, to strengthen his own stance?
Well, yes and yes. It's both because he needed to do something because he needed to protect the 40% of his oil comes from Iran, and if he can also make friends with Saudi Arabia, they could possibly do deals with Saudi Arabia for oil. On top of that, it shows that China can operate as a peacemaker in an area of the world that it doesn't have a lot of influence other than in Iran. So it wants to be a superpower. It is building nuclear weapons like it wants to be a superpower, and it's threatening Taiwan and other countries in the South China Sea over oil rights. One of the main things that's preventing it from becoming a superpower is lack of oil, and the need to go everywhere in the world and find oil and buy it as cheaply as you can. And by taking the oil away in Venezuela, which was about uh, you know 20% of its oil import, and from Iran, which was 40%. The rest of it comes from Russia, and Russia's doing just fine right now because of oil prices. They're making lots of money, which they're unfortunately going to use part of it in their war in Ukraine. But at the same time, this is a play for control of a very important region in the world that has what the world wants, and that happens to be oil and gas. 20% of it goes through the Strait of Hormuz. The United States has made itself more independent uh, from Middle Eastern oil. In fact, has become the number one producer of oil in the world, and has suggested to Europe and others that they might want to buy from us rather than the volatile Middle East. This has also become an issue of control of resources for those that would wish to do us harm, the so-called access of aggressors or China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. If this turns around in Iran, namely if a more democratic government comes and the autocratic Islamists fall, this would be very harmful to China as well as Russia because that's one of their main players in their alliances. And do I need to mention that the drones are developed by the Chinese and helped paid for by the oil money that the Iranians get from the Chinese, but also are shared with the Russians in Ukraine. The
Right.
Shahed drones are being used in Ukraine.
Yeah, the Ukrainians, from what I've heard, have some really crazy killer drones. Like they have some of the best in the world.
Yeah, and some counter drone technologies that they've had to develop because of the realities of war, 4 years of war on their territory. So it's all connected, isn't it? Because if you limit what Russia can sell, it makes less money that it can plow into Ukraine. Europeans buy Russian oil. They're buying from a country that they're trying to defend against in Ukraine and helping them finance their war. So I think the biggest strategic change has been the change of energy policy since, in fact, that has become what we are looking at as a cause of conflict in this administration, but certainly over the longer term since World War II. Energy resources are just as important as political resources, as economic resources. So
Yes.
we've touched on this before.
Oh yeah, no doubt. And then we'll kind of go a little bit of the coverage, right?
Yeah,
Where people, because sometimes people don't understand. The media doesn't always explain things in the right way.
they don't have time. They don't
Right. No,
have time.
yeah, I mean, and sometimes I don't think everybody wants to do the sensationalism to get views or clicks, right? But sometimes it feels like certain media people, not all outlets, but people do. But you've been doing it for a long time, and you can tell who's what. But what is the single most important thing happening in the U.S. Iran relations right now that nobody's reporting about? Because there's got to be that thing that nobody talks about that really just seems kind of like the straw on the camel's back, or the one that puts it back together.
The one thing that I think is on people's mind right now is how strong is the IRGC? It has a mosaic defense, namely, there are independent actors. Who's really in charge? Number one, after you've destroyed at least 2 or 3 echelons of leadership, who's in charge?
Right.
And they have 32 different provinces, and they have what you would call a diversified command structure where some of the command can be taken over in each of these provinces. And as a result, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing all the time. And what the hell is a ceasefire if nobody knows it exists, number one. And number two, I think the most important thing that hasn't been covered and is probably on the minds of many Americans, let alone Iranian refugees. When is the people going to rise up against the Islamic Republic and take over, or is it even going to happen?
I mean,
That
that's what we're all hoping for.
That's what everyone's hoping for, but hope needs to have
Action.
some sort of action on the ground, and those who are going to rise up are going to need weapons, and those who have already been killed are out of the fight and have probably created some reservations among those who have seen the people hung from cranes, have seen the wrestlers hung from a crane, have seen the women murdered in the streets, have seen the Basij on their motorcycles with submachine guns cutting down their sons and daughters.
Right.
That's going to, after 40 to 50,000 of those sort of things happening, the you can understand if people are going to wait a while before they go out in the streets. What are they going to fight with? Rocks? With Persian rugs? What are they going to fight with?
Right.
That's going to have to either be supplied by intelligence services like the Mossad or the CIA, or across borders through the Kurdish communities, that sort of thing. Hard to know, don't know, but you can bet that it looks like the the main focus has changed from civilians in the streets to how do we stop nuclear weapons from being developed in Iran. And that's important. The last thing I would say that has been ignored is that the only way that this is going to change is if you change the regime. You cannot have an Islamic republic, a death cult in charge of a country if you want all of these things to happen. I don't see a clear path to that. If 80% of the Iranians want a different government, they don't have the arms to overthrow the other 20%. And if 20% of Iran still wants to be in that government, that's 18 million people.
Wow. That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. So,
Wow.
and how are you going to eradicate that without boots on the ground?
Right. I mean, you
And
can't.
what are the casualties going to be, if you have to put boots on the ground in a place 3 to 4 times the size of Iraq with very difficult, even Alexander the Great had headaches and nightmares going through Persia because of its terrain. And, they've had 47 years to build tunnels to put their missiles and armaments in and hide, across the country. And most of our attention has been put on Western Iraq. Eastern Iraq, we still have ways to go there. And I think we're hoping that the regime collapses from within due to the economics of it.
Right.
But hoping and seeing it happen are two different things.
Dude, you're not lying there. So I mean, as we wrap this up and bring it home,
Yeah.
where do you you generally have a really good outlook or sensible outlook on where do you see this going in the next 30, 60 days?
Well, I think that the Strait of Hormuz is going to be a focal point, that it has to be open and it has to be open soon, and that if there are if there are any problems like the ones we've seen over the last couple of days, they have to be shut down, and that means militarily. 131 ships a day used to go through the Gulf. I don't think there's more than 10 to 20 that are going through now. And as long as that choke point, that energy choke point remains there, whoever's in charge of Iran still has some leverage. That I think the next 60 days have to be focusing on opening the strait and continuing to blockade the Iranians from getting any oil out, so that it affects their economy in an even worse way, where they'll have to unconditionally surrender. And that's where I see this having to go, or else it's going to be long, prolonged, and we'll be talking about this for the next couple of years.
Well, at least it pays the bills. No, I'm just kidding.
Maybe your bills.
Not quite yet. Not quite yet. One day, maybe.
Not
One
mine
day.
either. Not mine either. But
One day.
one day we'll both get paid for doing something like this. But in any case, the I think we went in because we had to. I don't know if how we get out of it, because we have to.
Right. I mean, and it's going to be tough, and my thing is, and I've said this before, is I think if people are willing to stand up and fight for themselves, I've got zero issue if we supply them with the things they need to stand up for themselves.
Right.
Especially if it's on the side of a cause like this, and to my fellow Americans out there that are about to get up in arms over that comment, we as a country had significant help from other countries to
France.
create our revolution. Yes. And so it is okay in certain instances. And, my stance has always been, can you stand on your own 2 feet and do it? That's where I'm always, if you're not willing to sacrifice your own stuff, why should I?
Yeah. Well, and it's so difficult because the Iranian people have been under oppression for 47 years, and the terrible things they've had to endure. But they have to. They are the ones that are going to have to stand up and fight for the future and the fight for their future generations. And to the extent that we can help them do that, and we promise to help them do it, I believe the phrase was "help is on the way." And take names. Help has been on the way now for a month and some odd, and we're shutting down the economic lifeline of the oppressors. But at the same time, we're going to have to see that majority of Iranian people stand up and fight for their own rights, as I think they will and hope they will, because otherwise this is going to go on for quite a long time.
No, it will. No, no doubt. Ron, as always, one of the few people I trust to give me the real picture of what I don't know, and it's always a blessing. Ron, tell everybody about your project.
Well, I've got a project where I'm trying to teach the next generation about international relations as well as diplomacy, and that's at Oxford University. We have a 3.5 week seminar called the Oxford Study Abroad Program in International Relations, and the next one will take place this July, 2026. We do it every July, and I'd love anyone who has an interest in coming to the world's oldest English speaking university that has produced 31 prime ministers and
Wow.
lots of knowledge, and in an atmosphere where all points of view happen to be encouraged and debated. And then afterwards, you go to the pub for a beer and talk it out like Ronald Reagan used to do with Tip O'Neill back in the day. But in any case, I do this every July, and if you want to learn about it, you can go to my website, learnthroughtravel.com. And there's still some spots open for this July if you want to come. But if it's too soon to plan, then there'll always be next year. And thanks for allowing me to give a plug, Joe.
No problem at all. No issue. Well, everybody, I'm glad you enjoyed this tonight. Give it a like, share, subscribe, follow. I appreciate everybody tuning in, and everybody have a good day.